The wind was howling outside, a wild beast roaring against the weathered logs of Boone Kincaid's cabin. It was a storm, like no other. The Wyoming Territory had thrown its worst at him, and Boone Kincaid wasn't one to back down. He stood alone in the dim light of his cabin, wrapping his thick woolen scarf around his neck, staring out the small window as snowflakes danced in the air like restless ghosts. The cattle needed to be secured. Boone could feel the weight of the storm bearing down on him, thick and heavy like a quilt wrapped around the land. He shoved the door open, stepping out into the swirling snow, his boots sinking into the deep drifts as he made his way to the barn. The sound of hooves crunching in the snow and the low bellowing of his cattle filled the air. It was a battle, him against the storm and the clock. The wind picked up, the sky darkening with every minute, a thick veil of snow beginning to blanket the ground. Boone moved quickly, working with practiced hands as he wrestled the cattle into the barn, each one reluctant to go where it was warm and safe. The storm was closing in fast, and there was no room for mistakes. Once the last of the animals were secured, Boone slammed the barn door shut and stood in the doorway for a moment, catching his breath. He could feel the burn in his muscles from the effort, but he was used to it. His life had always been this way: constant hard work, relentless weather, and the quiet hum of solitude. Back inside the cabin, Boone stoked the fire, watching the flames leap up, casting long shadows on the walls. He took a seat in his chair, pulled his thick wool coat tighter around his shoulders, and looked at the crackling fire, his thoughts wandering to places he never liked to go. Loneliness had been his companion for many years now, ever since his family had passed, leaving him to carve out a life on his own in the wild. His fingers drummed lightly on the armrest, the rhythmic sound steady in the otherwise quiet cabin. But as the minutes passed, a strange sound broke through the silence, 3 weak knocks on the door. Boone froze, his instincts immediately kicking in. He grabbed the Winchester rifle propped against the wall, his knuckles tight around the barrel. The knocking came again, faint but distinct, and this time it was followed by a whispering cry that sent a chill down his spine. He felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up, and every instinct told him something was wrong. No one would be out in a storm like this unless they had no other choice. Boone stood motionless for a moment, the only sound the howling wind that seemed to shake the walls. His nearest neighbor was miles away, and even he wouldn't dare to venture out in this weather. Another knock. "Who's there?" Boone called out, his voice low and rough. His eyes darted to the door, then to the window, but all he could see was the blinding white of the storm. There was no answer, only the harsh wind. His hand tightened on the rifle as he approached the door, slowly lowering the bar that held it shut. He swung it open, a gust of icy wind slamming into him, nearly knocking him off his feet. The snow swirled around him like a wall of white, and then he saw her, a woman. She was standing there, her body swaying in the wind, barely upright. Her long dark hair was frozen in icy strands, and her face, pale as porcelain, was twisted with cold. Her dress, once a deep blue, was stiff with frost, clinging to her like a second skin. In her hand, she gripped a small bag, but her fingers were so numb they appeared as though they were carved from ice. Boone didn't hesitate. Without a thought, he dropped his rifle and lunged forward, catching her just as she crumpled to the ground. She was light, fragile, like a bird caught in a storm, and Boone struggled to lift her. He dragged her inside, slamming the door shut behind them. Inside, the warmth of the fire hit them both. He eased her onto the rag rug in front of the hearth, his hands trembling slightly as he worked to remove the wet, frozen clothes from her body. He added more wood to the fire, watching the flames leap higher, eager to warm her, to bring her back from the edge of death. Her eyes fluttered open, bright green as new spring grass. Boone's heart skipped a beat as he stared into them, not sure what to say. She was alive, but barely. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" he asked softly, though his voice was rough with exhaustion and worry. She gave a weak nod, but her teeth chattered so violently he feared they might break. Boone reached for the blankets piled on his bed, wrapping them around her body, then hesitated. She was still in her wet, frozen dress. "Your dress," he began, his voice gruff but gentle. "It's got to come off, or you'll catch your death." The woman's eyes flew open, her face filled with alarm. Boone quickly turned his back, his face burning with a mix of embarrassment and respect. "I won't look," he assured her, though his heart was racing. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside the cabin the fire crackled, a flicker of hope amidst the snow's fury. Boone waited, listening to the sound of her soft movements behind him. And then, finally, she spoke. I'm decent," she whispered. Boone turned, relieved to see her wrapped in his blankets, looking up at him with gratitude, though exhaustion still weighed heavily in her eyes. "Thank you," she murmured. The fire crackled in the hearth, the warmth seeping into Waya Thundercloud's frozen bones as Boone stoked the flames. He sat beside her, a mug of hot coffee in his hands, though it was his gaze that held her attention. She shivered from the cold, but it wasn't just the storm that had turned her pale and fragile. It was the story she carried, one she could no longer keep to herself. Waya's green eyes flickered to the fire, but her thoughts were far away, lost in a time and place Boone couldn't reach. His voice, though soft, cut through the silence between them, pulling her back to the present. "Ma'am," Boone said gently, his rough voice a stark contrast to her delicate tone. "What happened out there? You ain't from around here?" Waya hesitated. She had known rejection all her life, had felt the sting of being cast aside by those who were supposed to care. But Boone's quiet patience made her feel something she hadn't felt in a long time. Safety. And so, with a deep breath, she spoke. "I was promised," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, but strong enough for Boone to hear. "To a man named Jed Holt, a rancher. He's wealthy, owns land on the other side of the valley. My family made the arrangement." Boone didn't interrupt. He could see the pain in her eyes, but he knew there was more to the story. Waya continued, her hands trembling as she wrapped the blankets tighter around herself, though it was more from the weight of her past than from the cold. "He sent for me," she said, the words feeling heavy in her mouth. "I was to come west to marry him, to start a life, to help him with his ranch. My family had no choice but to send me. We didn't have much after my father died. We were desperate." Boone's brow furrowed. He'd heard of Jed Holt, a man with wealth and a reputation for being hard, even cruel. But this wasn't something Boone expected. "He met me when I got off the train," she continued, her voice trembling slightly. "He didn't look at me the way I thought he would. I wasn't what he expected." Her gaze drifted to the fire, as if she could see the whole scene play out again in the flames. "He said I was too thin, too weak, said I wouldn't survive Wyoming. I tried to explain that I was just a woman from a different world, but he didn't care. I wasn't what he wanted." Waya paused, her throat tight as she struggled to hold back the tears. Boone felt the pit in his stomach twist with anger, but he kept his face steady, watching her with an empathy that most men wouldn't offer. He He took me as far as the fork in the road and told me to find my way back to town, she whispered, the pain sharp in her voice. He said I had to hurry, that the snow wouldn't be bad, that I could make it. She drew a shaky breath, looking directly at Boone now, her eyes filled with a mix of hurt and defiance. And then he left me there with nothing but my bag and a few dollars. Boone's fists clenched, the firelight reflecting the fury that burned inside him. A man like Jed Holt, rich and powerful, treating a woman like that, leaving her to die in the snow. It made Boone's blood boil. I couldn't see the road. The snow came too fast. I walked, but the storm blinded me. I saw your light, and I thought, maybe I had a chance, she finished softly, her eyes downcast. The silence that followed felt thick, like the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. Boone wasn't sure what to say. He had always fought for survival, for his land, for his cattle. But to hear this woman's story, to know how she had been betrayed by a man she was supposed to trust, it shook him to his core. I won't go back to him, Waya said suddenly, her voice stronger now, a quiet determination setting in. I won't be his property. Boone nodded, his expression grim. You don't belong to no man, he said firmly, his voice unwavering. Not him, not anyone. You'll stay here as long as you need to, Waya. I'll make sure of it. Her eyes softened, the faintest flicker of gratitude in them. Thank you, she whispered, her voice barely audible, but Boone heard it all the same. As the storm raged outside, Boone sat by the fire, keeping his eyes on Waya as she slowly warmed. He didn't say it aloud, but something about her strength, despite everything she had been through, stirred something in him. He was no stranger to hardship, but this woman had endured more than most could imagine. And yet here she was, alive, still fighting, still willing to trust. Boone wasn't sure what the future would hold for them, but one thing was clear. He wouldn't let her face it alone. The storm outside raged like a wild animal, thrashing against the cabin as Boone sat silently by the fire. He could feel the heat of the flames, but it didn't chase away the coldness in his heart. Waya lay in the corner, wrapped in blankets, her shivering slowing as the warmth took hold. But Boone knew the storm would pass, and when it did, things would change. They always did. He had lived most of his life alone, his family gone, his friends distant, and the land his only companion. He wasn't used to sharing his space with anyone, much less a woman. But as he looked over at Waya, something stirred inside him. There was a tenderness in her, a quiet strength that Boone hadn't expected. She wasn't just some fragile thing to be protected. No, she had a fire in her, a fire that had kept her alive through the worst storm of her life, a fire that refused to be snuffed out by the cruelty of Jed Holt or the unforgiving cold of the Wyoming wilds. Boone wrestled with his own thoughts. His loneliness had always been a silent companion, something he'd learned to live with. He had always told himself that being alone was better than trusting anyone. But now, with Waya in his cabin, that old habit of solitude felt heavy. He'd seen how she fought back the cold, how she'd survived when any other woman would have crumbled. He'd heard her story, and the anger in his gut still smoldered every time he thought of Jed Holt. A man like that, rich, powerful, and cruel, had cast her aside without a second thought. It made Boone sick, but it also made him wonder if she could ever truly be safe here. The world outside had no mercy. Even with the storm passing, the dangers of the wild, the people like Jed Holt, would still be out there, waiting. As Boone sat in the quiet cabin, his thoughts kept returning to Waya. What if she didn't want to stay here forever? What if she wanted to leave when the storm was over? He'd told her she was welcome, that she could stay as long as she needed. But deep down, he feared that once the snow cleared, she'd be gone. But then, he watched her as she slowly sat up from the blankets and stretched, her body stiff from the cold. Her green eyes met his across the room, and she gave him a small, grateful smile. She was stronger than she looked. Boone had no doubt about that now. Over the next few days, Boone found himself watching her more than he meant to. She had taken to moving around the cabin, doing small tasks, and it amazed him how quickly she adapted. She'd started cooking meals with the few supplies he had, turning simple beans and bacon into something warm and filling. She even mended his clothes, stitching them with small, careful movements that told him she had learned more than just how to survive. Waya didn't just survive. She thrived. And for the first time in a long while, Boone saw something in her that went beyond the woman who had been abandoned in a snowstorm. She was capable, resourceful, and resilient. She wasn't someone who needed saving. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Waya handed him a cup of coffee. Her hands were steady now, no longer trembling from the cold. She smiled again, a genuine smile this time, and Boone couldn't help but notice how the firelight caught the warmth in her eyes. "You've got away with the stew," he said, his voice rough but approving. Waya laughed softly, the sound like a gentle breeze brushing through the trees. "I've had to learn how to cook for myself. There weren't many people around who were willing to teach me." Boone felt a pang in his chest. The loneliness in her voice was something he recognized all too well, but now there was a spark in her. A spark that made him realize that maybe she hadn't just learned to survive. Maybe she had learned how to live. "Guess we both had to learn how to make it out here," Boone replied quietly, his eyes meeting hers. Waya nodded, her expression thoughtful. "We all learn, one way or another," she said softly. And Boone realized then, more clearly than ever, that the storm wasn't the only thing that had brought them together. The land, the loneliness, and the hardship. It had all led them here, to this small cabin, where the fire burned bright, and for the first time in years, Boone didn't feel so alone. But that didn't mean the future was any less uncertain. Waya was strong, yes, but the world outside would never stop testing her, just like it tested him. And while he might have brought her in from the storm, he knew that keeping her safe would be a fight, one they'd both have to face together. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world of white silence. Boone stood at the door of his cabin, the early morning light filtering through the frost-covered windows. He stretched his stiff muscles, his eyes lingering on the untouched snow outside. The wind had died down, but the tension inside his cabin still hung thick in the air. Waya was sitting by the fire, her fingers gently working a seam in one of Boone's shirts. She was getting stronger every day, her movements more assured, her voice softer. Boone found himself drawn to her resilience, the way she carried herself with quiet strength, even after everything she'd been through. It wasn't just her beauty or her spirit, it was her ability to heal, both herself and the space around her. But as much as he admired her, a shadow of worry loomed over him. He couldn't shake the thought that someone, or something, would come for her again. And when it did, he wasn't sure he could protect her the way she needed. Jed Holt's cruelty wasn't something Boone could forget easily. As if summoned by his thoughts, Boone heard the sound of hooves crunching in the snow outside. He froze, his heart skipping a beat. The quiet of the morning was shattered by the sudden arrival of 3 riders. The first man Boone recognized immediately, Jed Holt, sitting high in his saddle with that arrogant air that made Boone's blood boil. The other two were unfamiliar, but the sheriff's badge on the man's chest told Boone everything he needed to know. Boone's hand went instinctively to his rifle, but he kept his eyes on the door, waiting. He could feel Waya's presence behind him, and he knew she was already aware of the men outside. She didn't say anything, but he could feel the unease in the air between them. Jed Holt dismounted first, his boots crunching in the snow as he approached the door. The sheriff followed, his hands raised in a placating gesture, though Boone could see the discomfort in his eyes. The ranch hand hung back, watching the scene with a practiced, uninterested gaze. "Boone Kincaid!" Jed's voice rang out, as smooth and cold as the Wyoming winter. "I'm here to collect what's mine." Boone stepped forward, his boots heavy on the wooden floor as he moved into the doorway. "You've got no right to her," he said, his voice low and steady. Jed's eyes flickered to Boone, a smirk tugging at the corners of his lips. "I don't need a right when I've got a legal agreement between our families. Waya Thundercloud is mine by contract. I've paid for her, and I intend to take her back." Boone could see the anger simmering in Waya's eyes from across the room. Her posture was still, but Boone knew her too well by now to miss the way her jaw tightened, the flicker of defiance in her gaze. She wasn't going to let him have control over her anymore. "I'm not yours," Waya said, her voice steady, her chin lifted with quiet dignity as she stood up from her chair. The firelight illuminated her features, and in that moment, Boone saw something in her he hadn't noticed before, a strength that matched his own. Jed Holt's face twisted with annoyance, but Waya didn't flinch. "You left me to die in a blizzard, Holt," she continued, her voice gaining strength with each word. "You threw me out like I was nothing. I owe you nothing." Boone could feel the pride swelling in his chest. She was standing up to him, refusing to back down. The fire between them wasn't just from the hearth, it was the spark of something deeper, something Boone couldn't ignore. The sheriff looked uncomfortable, his eyes flickering between the two of them. He cleared his throat, stepping forward. "Mr. Holt," he said slowly, "there's nothing to settle here. The law's clear and I've seen enough. Waya Thundercloud has made her decision." Jed Holt's face darkened, but the sheriff's words hit him harder than any punch Boone could land. The law wasn't on his side, not this time. He had overplayed his hand, and now the world around him was shifting. Waya stepped forward, standing shoulder to shoulder with Boone. "I'm not going anywhere with you," she said, her voice unwavering. "I belong here, with Boone, and I won't be anyone's property." Jed Holt took a step back, his fists clenched at his sides. "You think you can just walk away from me? You'll regret this, Thundercloud," he spat, his words dripping with venom. "You'll come crawling back to me, you'll see." "Not if I have a say in it," Boone replied, his tone calm but firm. He took a step toward Jed, his voice a quiet warning. "And you won't be welcome here again. Get off my land, Holt." The two men stared each other down for a long moment, the tension thick in the air. Finally, Jed sneered and turned away, mounting his horse without another word. His ranch hand followed, but the sheriff remained behind, his eyes lingering on Boone and Waya. Waya met Boone's gaze, her eyes full of gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. Boone gave her a small smile, his chest tight. "You don't have to thank me. He won't bother you again." As Jed and his men disappeared into the distance, Boone closed the door, locking it tight against the world outside. The storm had passed, but the real fight was just beginning. The wind howled through the empty plains, sending icy gusts of snow swirling in the air like restless spirits. Boone Kincaid stood firm in the doorway of his cabin, his boots planted solid in the snow, his eyes fixed on the man riding toward him. Jed Holt. The man's broad shoulders and expensive clothes couldn't hide the cruelty in his eyes. The heavy hooves of his horse thudded against the frozen earth, breaking the eerie silence of the wilderness. Behind Jed, Sheriff Wade Hollister and a ranch hand watched with uneasy glances, knowing this wasn't going to end quietly. But Boone wasn't looking at them. His gaze was locked on Jed, the man who had tried to tear Waya's life apart, and now was standing on Boone's doorstep demanding what he thought was rightfully his. Boone's chest tightened, but he didn't step back. His hand rested on the grip of his rifle, but he didn't raise it yet. He wasn't sure if it would come to that, but he'd be damned if he let Jed walk away with Waya. "Boone Kincaid," Jed called out, his voice slick and smooth, like the way he rode his horse, arrogant and entitled. "I'm here for what's mine. I'll make this simple, and you'd be wise to stay out of it." Boone's voice was low but steady, like a thunderstorm gathering force. "She's not yours, Holt. You don't own her." Jed's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, it felt like the storm itself had come to a standstill. "She is," Jed said, his words sharp and calculated, his eyes never leaving Waya. "I've paid for her. You've got no say in this. She's my property." Boone stepped forward, his posture rigid and unwavering. "No man owns anyone, not in my world," he said, each word hanging heavy in the air. "You left her to die out there, and I'm not about to let you do it again." Waya, standing beside Boone, didn't flinch. She'd already heard enough. She took a slow step forward, her eyes meeting Jed's for the first time since he'd abandoned her. Her voice rang out clear and firm, cutting through the tension like a sharp blade. "I'm not your property, Jed Holt," she said, her words full of defiance. "I never was, and I never will be. You left me to die. I owe you nothing." Jed's expression twisted in anger, his face reddening. His horse snorted in protest, but Jed didn't care. He had no intention of backing down. "You can't just walk away from this, Waya," he sneered. "You'll regret this. You'll see. You'll come crawling back, I'm sure of it." Waya's eyes flashed with a fire Boone hadn't seen before. She stepped closer to him, putting herself between Jed and Boone. Her presence alone was enough to show Jed that she wasn't afraid anymore. "I'm not going anywhere with you," she said, her voice steady, strong. "Not now, not ever." The wind howled again, almost as if to punctuate her words. Boone could feel the weight of the moment, the quiet fury between them all. It was then that Sheriff Wade Hollister spoke up, stepping forward hesitantly. His badge gleamed in the weak sunlight, but there was no mistaking the uncertainty in his eyes. "Jed, I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but the law's clear here," Wade said, his voice firm, though there was an air of discomfort in his stance. "Waya has the right to choose. You've already dissolved the agreement with that letter." Jed's eyes flicked toward the sheriff, his jaw tightening. "What letter?" he barked, but Boone could see the flicker of doubt in his eyes. Wade reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the crumpled piece of paper Waya had kept from the moment Jed had left her in the storm. With deliberate slowness, he unfolded the letter and read it aloud, his voice carrying in the cold air. "Silas Blackwood hereby dissolves any understanding with Miss Waya Thundercloud, citing misrepresentation and unsuitability for ranch life. $10 is enclosed for her return passage." Jed's face went pale as the words sank in. His fingers twitched as if to snatch the letter away, but Wade held it up for all to see. $10, Wade read, "for her return passage. Is that all she was worth to you, Jed?" The wind seemed to howl louder, almost in answer. The truth hung heavy in the air, unraveling Jed's control over the situation. Boone could feel the change in the atmosphere. The sheriff had just sealed Jed's fate, the last thread of his authority snapping under the weight of his own lies. Waya stood tall, her eyes fixed on Jed. "You never had the right to claim me," she said, her voice unwavering. "And you never will." Jed stood motionless for a moment, his face contorted with anger, but his words were lost in the wind as he turned his horse away. He spat on the ground, muttering curses under his breath. "This isn't over, Kincaid," he growled. "You'll regret this." The ranch hand followed, and the sheriff gave Boone one last look, offering a silent apology for the mess Jed had created. "I'm sorry, Boone," he said quietly. "But the law's been set." Boone gave a nod, his jaw tight. "Thanks for doing the right thing, Sheriff." As the riders disappeared into the distance, Waya stepped back into the cabin, her breath visible in the cool air. Boone followed, the door clicking shut behind them. The tension in the air was palpable, but there was something else now, too. Relief. "Are you all right?" Boone asked, his voice softer now that the storm had passed. Waya looked up at him, her eyes filled with a strength that made Boone's heart swell. "I'm more than all right," she said quietly. "I'm free." The days that followed the confrontation were quieter, though not without their own tension. The storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape of white wilderness, but the air inside Boone's cabin remained thick with unspoken words and uncertain futures. The world outside was cold, but inside there was a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire crackling in the hearth. Waya had made her choice. She had stood her ground against Jed Holt. And now she stood beside Boone, in his home, in his life. The decision hadn't come easily for her. She knew the town would talk, the whispers would follow her like a shadow. But for the first time in a long while, she felt something she hadn't known in years, a sense of belonging. Boone wasn't sure what to expect. He had spent years alone on his land, surviving by his own hand, his own sweat, and the harshness of the Wyoming terrain. But he couldn't deny the truth any longer. He wasn't alone anymore. Waya was there. And though the future was uncertain, something about her presence in the cabin, by his side, brought a new rhythm to his life. She had become a steady presence in his home. Where once there had only been the quiet of a solitary man and his land, now there were two people working together, side by side. At first, Boone was cautious. He didn't know how to fit someone else into his routine, his life. But Waya didn't ask for much. She simply began to move with him, as if she had always belonged. In the mornings, she would help him tend to the cattle, her hands quick and sure, learning the work with a quiet determination. She had no hesitation, no fear of the hard labor that Boone had known all his life. She had learned to survive in ways Boone hadn't seen in many women. But it wasn't just survival she offered. She offered something more. Something Boone didn't know he needed. Waya would sit beside him in the evenings, her small frame curled up next to the warmth of the fire. Sometimes she spoke of her past, of her family, of the life she had left behind. But mostly, they sat in silence. The kind of silence that wasn't empty, but full of understanding. The kind that only those who had been through the storm together could share. Boone had always thought silence meant loneliness. But with Waya, it felt different. It was a comfortable quiet, a rhythm that made sense. It wasn't long before Boone began to realize something he hadn't expected. Waya wasn't just a woman to care for. She wasn't a burden or someone in need of saving. She was his equal, his partner. The work they did together wasn't just about surviving. It was about building something. A life, a home, a future. Boone started noticing the small things. How Waya's laugh could fill a room, how her hands worked with precision and care, how she spoke of things he had never considered. She spoke of stories from her people, of the land and the sky, of things he had never thought to learn. She had strength, not just in her hands, but in her heart. The same strength that had brought her to his cabin in the first place. The same strength that kept her standing when the world tried to knock her down. One evening, as the fire burned low and the wind howled outside, Boone found himself watching her as she worked, mending one of his worn shirts. The way she moved, so sure, so calm, he realized that he had come to depend on her in ways he hadn't expected. She had become part of his world, and maybe, just maybe, he was beginning to see her not just as the woman who had walked into his life on that stormy night, but as someone he couldn't imagine his world without. Waya looked up, catching him staring, and she smiled, that quiet, knowing smile of hers. Boone felt a warmth spread through him, a kind of contentment he hadn't known in years. "You're quiet," she said, her voice soft but steady. Boone shifted uncomfortably, scratching his chin. "Just thinking." "About what?" He hesitated, unsure how to put it into words. "About how things have changed," he said finally. "How they're better." Waya raised an eyebrow, her lips curving up in a small smile. "Better?" Boone nodded, his gaze meeting hers. "Yeah. Better." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that spoke of shared understanding. Boone didn't have all the answers. He wasn't sure what tomorrow would bring, or if Waya would stay with him forever. But right then, in that cabin, in that moment, he knew something had shifted. They were building a life together, one small piece at a time, one day at a time. And for the first time in a long while, Boone wasn't so sure he'd ever want it any other way. Waya smiled, her eyes soft. "I think so too," she whispered. And in that quiet, simple moment, Boone Kincaid felt a peace he hadn't known in years. The wind had finally quieted, but the storm within Stone Creek was just beginning. Word of Waya Thundercloud's stay at Boone Kincaid's cabin spread faster than a prairie fire. It didn't take long for the gossip to seep through the town's cracked streets and wooden storefronts. Folks who had never set foot on Boone's land had plenty to say about what was happening behind his cabin's walls. Boone had expected some talk. After all, he was used to living on the edge of things, the kind of man people rarely understood. But now, with Waya in his life, the whispers took on a life of their own. Some folks in town looked at Boone like he had taken a woman away from Jed Holt, as if he'd stolen her away like cattle. Others whispered about Waya herself, calling her a fallen woman, a girl abandoned by a man who had promised her a life she'd never see. In the saloon, men looked at Boone with cold eyes, talking in hushed voices over their whiskey. It wasn't just the women who judged Waya, it was the men, too. Boone could feel it every time he walked into town, the way they looked at him, some with disdain, others with barely hidden admiration. They didn't know the full story. They only knew what they saw, and sometimes that was enough for people to judge. It wasn't long before the good folks of Stone Creek found their own voices. It came from places Boone hadn't expected. Dr. Seth Carter, the town's physician, came by Boone's cabin one afternoon, his coat dusted with the remnants of the storm. He wasn't much for small talk, but there was a kindness in the man's eyes that Boone could see from the moment he stepped through the door. "Boone," he said, his voice gruff with the weight of the world, "I hear the town's been talking." Boone didn't have to ask what about. He already knew. "Folks can talk all they want," Boone said, his voice low, not wanting to get too caught up in it. "But they don't know the truth." Dr. Carter nodded, taking off his hat and placing it on the small table. "You're right about that. People talk. but some of them know what's good, and I've known you long enough to see you're a good man. That girl, Waya, she ain't done nothing wrong." Boone gave him a small nod, though his chest still felt tight. "She's been through enough already. Doesn't help when folks make things worse." "She's a survivor, Boone," Dr. Carter said, his tone softening. "And you're not alone in standing up for her. My wife, Eliza, she's been talking to the other women. They don't like the gossip neither. You've got more support in this town than you know." That surprised Boone more than anything. He hadn't expected much kindness from the town's women. It wasn't that they were unkind, but they didn't exactly take to strangers, especially ones with Waya's background. But here was Dr. Carter, offering the first real piece of solidarity he'd gotten since the rumors started. "You're not the only one with a hand to extend," Dr. Carter added, pushing a hand through his hair, his face serious. "I'll be around if you need any help, Boone, and so will Eliza. Waya deserves better than what's been said. And so do you." Boone stood there for a long moment, considering the offer. It wasn't just a handshake or a few kind words. It was something deeper, something real. "Thanks, Seth," Boone said quietly, a weight lifting off his shoulders. "I appreciate it, more than you know." As Dr. Carter left, Boone looked toward the window, his mind racing. Things weren't going to be easy. Jed Holt was still out there, lurking like a shadow, and there was no telling what he would do next. But for the first time, Boone didn't feel so alone in this fight. He and Waya had found something in each other, and now it seemed they had allies in town too. Maybe they didn't have to face the world by themselves. Waya had become more than just the woman who had come to him in a storm. She was his partner, his equal. The life they were building together wasn't just about survival. It was about finding a place where they could both stand tall. Boone had given her a home, but now she was giving him the strength to face the future, no matter how uncertain. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy, and the whispers would still come. But as long as they had people who believed in them, as long as Boone had Waya by his side, he knew they could weather any storm, inside or out. "Boone," Waya's voice interrupted his thoughts, soft but steady from across the room. She was standing by the window, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "It's good, isn't it? That we're not alone anymore." Boone nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Yeah, it's good." And as the sun dipped below the snow-covered horizon, Boone realized something that hadn't been true before. He wasn't alone anymore. Neither of them were. The week since the storm had passed slowly, the winds of the Wyoming territory calming, leaving Boone and Waya to rebuild their lives together. The land was quiet, and the days felt longer than they ever had before. But Boone had learned to enjoy the peace. The daily rhythm of tending to the cattle, fixing fences, and working the land had become a comfort. The space inside the cabin, once so empty, now felt full, and Boone found himself looking forward to coming back to it at the end of the day, knowing Waya would be there. But as Boone tended to the morning chores one cold, clear day, a shadow loomed on the horizon. He could feel it before he saw it. An unease, an air of something that didn't belong. The day had been calm, with only the distant sound of the wind stirring the dry grass, but the sound of approaching horses broke the silence. Boone squinted against the morning sun and saw them coming. Jed Holt, riding high on his horse, flanked by a ranch hand. Boone's heart sank into his chest. He knew it wasn't over, but he had hoped, foolishly perhaps, that it would be. The truth was, Jed Holt was a man who didn't take rejection easily. Jed rode up to the cabin, his face hard, his expression more determined than ever. Boone stood, watching him approach, his instincts kicking in. His hand rested instinctively on the rifle slung across his back, but he held still, waiting to see what game Jed had come to play this time. Jed dismounted, his boots crunching in the snow as he made his way toward Boone. He looked over at Waya, standing near the door, her arms crossed, a quiet strength in her posture. Jed's gaze lingered on her for a moment before he turned to Boone. "Boone Kincaid," Jed said, his voice smooth but with an edge of bitterness. "I've come to settle this matter once and for all." Boone raised an eyebrow, his jaw tight. "You've had your say, Holt. She ain't going back with you." Jed smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was a smile that was meant to deceive, to manipulate. "She doesn't have much choice, does she? A letter arrived just this morning. Her father, he's gravely ill, Boone. He needs her back in Boston." Boone's heart skipped a beat, and he could see the flash of confusion in Waya's eyes. She stepped forward, her posture rigid, her brow furrowing as she listened to Jed's words. She wasn't fooled, but Boone could see the small spark of doubt in her gaze. "Her father's dead," Boone said, his voice steady. He'd heard the truth of it from Waya herself. "That's nothing but a lie." Jed's smile widened, and he reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a folded letter. "It's all right here," he said, waving it in front of Boone. "Signed and sealed. Proof of the illness. And I've even arranged for her return passage to Boston. She'll be taken care of, unlike the way you're caring for her." Waya stepped forward, her voice low but clear. "You're lying, Jed," she said, her words sharp as a knife. "My father passed 2 years ago. I'm not leaving Boone, not for you and not for anyone." Jed's expression faltered, but only for a second. He stepped closer to her, his voice smooth like a snake's hiss. "You think you can escape this, Waya? I'll pay for your passage. I'll take care of you like I promised. You're nothing more than a burden to him." Boone's anger flared, and he took a step forward, his jaw tight. "She's not a burden, and she's not yours to control, Holt. You left her to die in a storm, and now you think you can just take her back like a piece of cattle?" The wind picked up, biting cold against their skin as the tension grew. Waya stood her ground, her eyes blazing with fire as she met Jed's gaze. "I'm not going anywhere," she said firmly, her voice full of strength. "I found a place here, a real place, and no amount of lies or money can take that from me." Jed's face twisted with rage. He looked at Boone, his eyes narrowing with disdain. "You think she belongs here with you? You're just a lonely man, Boone. She's not going to stay with you forever. You'll see." Waya's hand reached out, touching Boone's arm in a gesture of quiet support. The words she didn't say were enough. He could feel it in the way she held him, steady and unshaken by Jed's venom. "I'll never go back to you, Jed," Waya said softly, her voice unwavering. "I'm not your property anymore." Jed stood there, seething, but Boone saw the defeat in his eyes. It was over. There would be no more lies, no more manipulation. Waya had spoken her truth, and Jed knew there was nothing left to say. "Get off my land," Boone said, his voice low but powerful, "and take your lies with you." Jed's face flushed red, his hand twitching as if he might lash out, but he held himself back. He turned without another word and mounted his horse, riding away with his ranch hand trailing behind him. Boone and Waya stood in the doorway of the cabin, watching as Jed disappeared into the horizon. The wind still howled, but now it seemed quieter, as though the storm had passed for good. Boone turned to Waya, his heart pounding in his chest. "You made the right choice," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Waya smiled, a quiet, steady smile that spoke of more than just relief. "I'm where I belong now," she said, her eyes meeting his. "With you." The air in Stone Creek was thick with the kind of tension you could feel in your bones, the kind that came from a fight that had been brewing for far too long. The morning had started like any other, but as the townsfolk gathered in the square, the whispers of Jed Holt's latest gambit spread like wildfire. Jed had returned to town with a mission. This time, he wasn't just going to take Waya back. No, he planned to tear Boone down in the process. Armed with forged letters and false claims, he had come to paint Boone and Waya as criminals, to twist the truth into something ugly enough to sway the townspeople to his side. It was the kind of game Jed played, one of lies, manipulation, and deceit. He had no intention of losing, not this time. But what Jed hadn't counted on was the strength that had come from Boone and Waya's bond, or the growing support they had in Stone Creek. The good folk of the town weren't as easily swayed as Jed had hoped. Sheriff Wade Hollister stood at the center of the town square, his hand resting on the handle of his revolver, his gaze steady and firm. He had known Jed Holt for years, and the way he was conducting himself now didn't sit well with the lawmen. The sheriff had always believed in doing things by the book, but even he couldn't ignore the lies Jed was spreading. The town had begun to rally behind Boone and Waya, and now, as Jed took center stage with his forged documents, the truth was about to come to light. Jed presented his evidence, waving papers in the air and shouting about the agreement between him and Waya's family. The crowd shifted uncomfortably, but Boone didn't flinch. Waya stood beside him, her posture strong, her gaze unwavering. She knew what this moment meant. She had faced Jed before, and this time she wouldn't let him control her. "You're lying, Jed," Waya called out, her voice cutting through the noise of the crowd. "You never had the right to claim me, and you never will." Jed sneered, his face red with anger. "You can't escape this, Waya. These documents prove everything. You belong to me, whether you like it or not." The townspeople murmured among themselves, some of them looking uncertain, but Sheriff Hollister raised his hand, silencing the crowd. "Enough of this," he said, his voice firm and commanding. "I've seen these so-called documents, Jed, and I've seen the truth." Waya's heart pounded as Sheriff Hollister took the step forward, the weight of his words settling into the air. "These papers," the sheriff continued, "are forgeries, and you, Jed Holt, have been lying to this town." The truth hit like a thunderclap. Boone felt a weight lift off his chest as the crowd's gaze shifted from Jed to Sheriff Hollister. There was no turning back now. Waya stepped forward, her voice steady, every word deliberate. "You left me in the snow to die, Jed," she said, her eyes locked on his. "And you think you can just walk in here and take me back like nothing ever happened? I'm not your property. Not now, not ever." Jed's eyes flickered with something close to panic, but Waya wasn't done. "You treated me like I was nothing," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "But I'm not nothing, and I'm not going back to you, not for any reason." The townsfolk were beginning to see Jed for who he truly was, a man who would do anything to get what he wanted, even if it meant destroying those who stood in his way. Waya's courage was contagious, and it sparked a shift in the crowd. No one wanted to side with a man who was willing to abandon a woman in a blizzard and then lie about it to save face. Sheriff Hollister nodded, his voice calm but firm. "Jed, you've made your last mistake. You don't get to take her back. She belongs here, with Boone." With the truth out in the open, there was nowhere for Jed to run. His face twisted in fury as he glanced around, realizing the town had turned against him. The sheriff stepped forward, his hand still resting on his gun, ready to act if needed. "You're done here, Holt," Boone said, his voice low but carrying the weight of finality. "Get off my land, and don't come back." Jed clenched his fists, his knuckles white with rage, but he knew he'd lost. Without another word, he turned his horse and rode off, his ranch hand following in silence. The air seemed to breathe again as the crowd slowly began to disperse. The tension that had gripped the town for so long started to ease, and Boone, for the first time in what felt like forever, could breathe without the weight of Jed Holt's threat hanging over him. Waya stepped closer to Boone, her face still set with determination, but there was a softness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. "Thank you," she whispered. Boone nodded, his gaze softening. "You did this, Waya. You stood your ground. I'm proud of you." The storm had passed, and as the sun broke through the clouds, casting light over the quiet town of Stone Creek, Boone and Waya knew that their fight was far from over. But together, with the town's support and the truth on their side, they were ready for whatever came next. The winds had settled, and the land was quieter now, more peaceful. Boone Kincaid's ranch had become a home, no longer just a place to survive, but a place to live, to build, and to love. The soil beneath their feet was rich with promise, and every morning, Boone could feel the weight of the past few months lifting, replaced by something far more enduring. Waya stood by his side, the woman who had once walked into his life on a stormy night, now his partner in every sense of the word. Together, they had transformed the land around them into something that felt like home. And that afternoon, under the shade of the large cottonwood tree near their cabin, Boone and Waya stood before their friends, their family, people who had once whispered behind their backs, now standing together in support. The ceremony was simple, just as Boone had always imagined it would be. The wind rustled through the cottonwood branches, carrying with it the scent of the earth and the promise of a new beginning. There were no grand speeches, no fancy decorations, just a few heartfelt words and a quiet exchange of vows. When Boone slipped the simple ring onto Waya's finger, it wasn't just a piece of jewelry. It was a bond, a legacy passed down from his mother, a woman who had known hardship but had always kept her family close. Boone's hands trembled slightly as he held Waya's, and when she looked up at him, he saw the same quiet strength in her eyes that had drawn him to her from the start. She had never needed saving. She had only needed someone who would stand beside her, someone who would see her for who she truly was. Not a victim, but a survivor. A woman who had carved her place in this world with courage and tenacity. When the ceremony was over, and the simple vows had been exchanged, they stood together beneath the cottonwood, surrounded by their friends and family. The sunlight filtered through the leaves above, casting dappled shadows on the ground. For Boone, it was a moment of quiet reflection, a moment to realize that the life he had built with Waya was more than he had ever dreamed possible. Together, they had faced down storms, both literal and metaphorical, and had come out stronger for it. As the days passed, Boone and Waya's bond grew deeper. Their love wasn't perfect, but it was real, grounded in the soil of the land they had worked side by side. Waya had become more than just Boone's wife. She had become a respected leader in the community. Her strength, her wisdom, and her unwavering resolve had earned her the admiration of those around her. Waya's journey had been long and hard, but now, in the quiet of their home, she could reflect on how far she had come. From the day she was abandoned in a blizzard to the woman standing before Boone, ready to build a life with him. Everything had changed, and as she looked down at their 2 children, small but full of promise, she knew that her past had shaped her into someone strong, someone who could weather whatever came their way. Their children, Emma and James, grew up in a home full of laughter and love. Boone watched them with pride, knowing that the legacy they were building was one of mutual respect, strength, and understanding. Waya had given him the gift of family, the gift of a life he had never thought possible. and in return, Boone had given her the stability and love she had always craved. Years passed, and the ranch grew, just like their family. The land that had once been a symbol of Boone's isolation now flourished with the warmth of his family's love. Waya had become the heart of their home, her presence a constant reminder of the power of perseverance and the importance of love. As they stood together on the porch of their cabin, watching the sun set over the valley, Boone pulled Waya close. The sky above was a brilliant orange, the last light of the day painting the land in hues of gold and pink. He kissed her forehead, his heart full of gratitude for the life they had built together. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" Waya said softly, her voice filled with the quiet wisdom she had gained over the years. Boone smiled, his eyes reflecting the same strength he saw in her. "Yeah, we sure have." And in that moment, as the last light of the day faded into twilight, Boone Kincaid knew that the best things in life had indeed come disguised as disasters. But in the end, those disasters had led him to the woman who had become his world, and to a family that would carry their legacy for generations to come. Together, they had built something that no storm, no man, and no lie could ever tear down.